Good morning and welcome to the 8th meeting of the COVID-19 Committee in 2021. Today the committee has received apologies from Monica Lennon MSP and Willie Coffey MSP. Can I welcome Alec Rowley MSP to the meeting as Monica's substitute? This morning the committee will be taking evidence on COVID-19, the next steps. We have the following witnesses: Michael Clancy, Director of Law Reform, Law Society of Scotland; Ian Smith, National and Local Policy Manager, Inclusion Scotland; Callum Steele, General Secretary, the Scottish Police Federation; and Alison Watson, Director of Shelter Scotland. Can I welcome you all to this meeting? And if we can please start first with short opening remarks from each of the panellists. And Mr. Clancy, can we please start with you? And I understand you need to leave this meeting by 11 a.m. Thank you.
Good morning, Convener, and thank you very much for the opportunity to attend the committee. In talking about the next steps for COVID-19, of course, a lot is going on at the moment, and we've got to be thinking about the way in which the disease is managed in the immediate future and hopefully controlled in the not too distant future. The Society, in publishing its priorities document for the 2021 elections, has identified that COVID-19, of course, has been a terrible and destructive element in our society since last year. Many of the secure and stable bases upon which we were proceeding prior to last year have been radically altered. And this stretches across the entire aspect of society and civic life, our justice system, business, family life, the work of the Parliament, the legislative output of the Parliament. All of these have been affected, and of course the terrible toll of death has affected almost every family in the country. So in moving on, it is a solemn thing to do, to think about the future and a release of the restrictions under which we all currently live. But I think we can look at things such as the justice system and how to make sure that it is improved and resilient for the future. We can look at our whole approach to emergency legislation and how we can improve it for future threats. And of course, we can also consider aspects about the health of the country and how we prepare for any future pandemics or other such events. I think I'll leave it there, Convener, knowing that others have got things to say as well.
Thank you, Mr. Clancy. I wonder if we can now move to Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, please.
Thank you, Convener. Inclusion Scotland is the national intermediary for disabled people's organisations, and we try to ensure that the lived experience of disabled people is taken account of in all policy making decisions. In respect of the COVID-19 emergency legislation, both the UK legislation and the Scottish Acts, we have expressed concerns that the rights of disabled people have been impacted negatively by this legislation, and not sufficient account was taken of the UK state obligations in terms of the United Nations Convention on Rights of Disabled People when the emergency legislation was drawn up, with particular concerns in relation to the provisions in relation to assessments for adult social care, some of the provisions in relation to mental health in the UK Acts, both of which have either not been commenced or have been suspended, but also in relation to the adults with incapacity provisions within the Scottish Acts, which we feel were unnecessary and in fact are a direct and serious breach of the human rights of adults with incapacity. In general terms, I think there must be a serious question as to why 1 year on from the imposition of what was emergency legislation to deal with basically an unknown as to how services would be able to cope with the COVID-19, including those with that I referred to. We now have 1 year's experience. We know how services have adapted and coped. We have to question whether or not simply rolling forward the initial emergency legislation is the right way forward. Surely, after a year, there was time to review that legislation and bring forward a new act to address the continuing issues with COVID-19, rather than continuing to roll forward the same emergency legislation. In that respect, in particular, we feel that the legislation, as initially introduced, was about how services would cope with delivering in the COVID-19, rather than on the impact, rather than from the perspective of the individuals who were affected by that. And new legislation should be based on working with disabled people, for example, people with mental health issues, people with learning disabilities, and people who receive social care support, to ensure that their rights are respected in any emergency legislation which is brought forward, both in terms of dealing with COVID-19 and any future emergency legislation. So I think the big question we would have is firstly, is why the Scottish Government has not brought forward new, fresh legislation to take account of what has happened over the last year. And secondly, we would want to see in particular the provisions within the Scottish Act in relation to the adults with incapacity legislation withdrawn, because we feel that has a serious impact on the human rights of adults with incapacity. One aspect of that is why is the working group, which is looking at how the provisions in relation to adults with incapacity legislation work, does not include any representatives for people with learning disabilities. That is because the focus of this legislation has been on those who are charged with delivering a service rather than those who actually receive services. So there's a whole issue there about how we ensure that in future, as we move forward, we actually involve people with lived experience in the design of any future emergency legislation. And Inclusion Scotland strongly urged the committee to recommend to the Scottish Government that it does more to ensure that people who are affected by emergency legislation are included in the decisions about how that legislation is drawn up and implemented.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith, for that. Could I turn next to Callum Steele from the Scottish Police Federation? Mr. Steele.
Good morning, convener, and thank you. I think it's important to highlight from the get-go that the emergence of the global pandemic of coronavirus was obviously an emergency, and as an emergency service, the police were unsurprisingly asked to step into some of the public health expectations and to assist with the management of the governmental response to that pandemic. I believe that the police service in Scotland, probably significantly differently to the police service south of the border, has approached the challenges of the policing of the pandemic very, very well and very effectively. That was not always easy against the legislative environment within which they were operating. The speed with which legislation was changing and the frequency with which it was changing, and also the notice that was provided to those that were expected to enforce provisions, which were often incompatible with the political narrative that accompanied them at the time, was enormously challenging for the police service. I think it is important to reflect on the comments that have gone before about the way in which emergency legislation is utilised, and also the fact that now almost 12 months in to the point where we introduced the first piece of legislation, whether we necessarily serve either the institutions of the state best by continuing to roll over emergency legislation, or whether we take time to take stock and look genuinely at the things that have worked well and the things that haven't worked so well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Steele. And finally, could I ask Ms. Watson to make a statement? Ms. Watson.
Thank you very much. On behalf of Shelter Scotland, really pleased to have this opportunity to provide insight and evidence from the over 500,000 people that Shelter Scotland helps every year with their housing. And housing is very much at the centre of this public health emergency. Stay home is the key message about how we all stay safe individually, how we keep our communities safe. And I think the Scottish Government has shown great leadership in putting in place emergency protections, making sure that during the pandemic everyone is housed, and if you've got a home, we significantly reduce your chances of losing that. But we do need to recognise that before this pandemic, Scotland was already in the grip of a housing emergency. We'd had 3 consecutive years of rising homelessness. We've got record numbers of families trapped in temporary accommodation. And we need to recognise that being housed is vastly different from having a home. I think as we begin to look to hopefully the end of the pandemic, I think we need to recognise we've got a unique opportunity here because we can decisively end Scotland's housing emergency. We can look at the structural causes of that emergency, which is a lack of social homes, and make sure that we drive up the supply of social homes. And I think there's an immediate need to tackle some of the backlogs in our housing system by looking at the allocations of social tenancies to homeless households. So that takes Shelter Scotland to a place where we strongly support that all of the elements of Part 1 of the Coronavirus Scotland Act should be extended to September 2021. We are still in the pandemic. A lot of people are still not vaccinated, so it feels really important that people should not be facing the threat of eviction at this time. I think the pandemic has also shown us where our housing system has some weaknesses. And I think there's an opportunity to take some of the emergency actions and enshrine those in legislation, make them permanent as we go forward. For example, the pre-action requirements in the private rented sector. I think what we're seeing along with key partners is a worrying level of housing debt building up during the pandemic, and I think we need a clear exit strategy on that. I think we need to make sure that what looks like it's going to be an exceptional level of rent arrears, something that we provide an exceptional response to. Now, when you look at the latest monthly statistics from the Scottish Housing Regulator, that makes clear that we're now sitting, just in the social rented sector alone, at a situation where rent arrears are now £20 million more than they were before the pandemic. And Shelter Scotland commissioned research just before Christmas, which showed that 1 in 4 people who pay rent or a mortgage are really worried about how they keep pace with that, and are doing things like skipping meals and leaving the heating off in cold weather to keep meeting their housing costs. So I think we're getting a very strong sense of the real strain on household budgets of trying to keep up with their housing costs, and this is not the time to take the emergency protections that have done so well. We can't take those off, and we also can't have a cliff edge.
Thank you, Ms Watson, for that. And to all our panel for their opening remarks. We will now move to questions. Members will have about 8 or so minutes each to ask questions of witnesses. So as ever, can I ask we keep both questions and answers as concise as possible, and if there's time for supplementary questions, I'll indicate this once all members have had a chance to ask their questions. As ever, if members could indicate who their questions are directed towards, this will assist broadcasting. And I'll now turn to questions, and if I may, I would like to ask the first question. And this is to explore something that I think a lot of people have grappled with, particularly in terms of enforcement of emergency legislation, and that's the difference between guidance and actual regulation. And I know the Scottish Police Federation makes some observations about this in their submission, but I wonder if I could ask perhaps first Mr Clancy and then Callum Steele if they have any further reflections on that dynamic. Mr Clancy first, please.
Thank you, Convener. It's an interesting question. Guidance crops up in statutory interpretation in many ways and has been particularly noticeable in connection with the coronavirus legislation. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, the coronavirus legislation it presents a hitherto unprecedented set of restrictions on personal liberty, and the provision of guidance to explain that legislative framework is important so that people can understand on which side of the law they fall. This is particularly important, I think, in terms of making sure that when we think about good law, we want law which is clear, consistent, comprehensible and accessible. Some, without any disrespect to the Parliamentary Council who have been drafting these measures, some of the more than 130 pieces of subordinate legislation which the Scottish Parliament has passed in connection with the coronavirus crisis, it might be interpreted by people as being dense, difficult to comprehend, and so therefore additional guidance is quite important. It's important also that when that guidance is explained by ministers and others, that people understand the difference between guidance and the law, and I would say that that should include ministers and others. Frequently at the very beginning of the crisis, we were told that you could go out to exercise for an hour or 2 hours. But of course, when one looked at the coronavirus legislation, there was no such limitation of time in the actual legislation. And I think that consistency between what is in the law and the messaging around the guidance which informs people's understanding of the law has to be quite up there as a front and foremost objective. I hope that answers your question.
It's very helpful. Mr. Steele, do you have any further observations?
I agree, Convener, almost ostensibly with the comments that Mr. Clancy has made. The one thing that I would maybe add to that is that I'm not entirely sure that I would necessarily take the view that much of the guidance that accompanied the legislation did in fact accompany the legislation. It was guidance that was issued by the government, in many instances almost separate to the provisions of the legislation. The guidance frequently went beyond what the legislation provided. The example in terms of exercise duration was one of them. Another was obviously in terms of the distance in which individuals could travel to exercise. And for a long period of time, and I dare say to some extent it probably still prevails, there is genuine confusion amongst the public that our members interact with about what it is that they are meant to be doing. Now, the general message tends to be, if you follow the guidance, you will almost certainly be within the law, is probably accurate. And of course, it is ultimately for parliamentarians to decide whether we want to be enforcing the will of ministers effectively on the population through guidance, or whether it is something that should sit within a statutory framework. So in that regard, I suppose the disconnect between guidance being applicable to the provisions of the law and guidance that often went beyond the provisions of the law was not particularly helpful. Had the guidance been in line with the description that Mr. Clancy, I think, very fairly articulated, then that would have been much more helpful for not just the police service, but also for the general public, who at some point didn't really know if they were coming or going.
Thank you for that. If I could stick with an issue of policing, Mr. Steele, this is something that arose in your submission, and I was struck by, I think, the suggestion that many, if charges were brought, they were brought using common law conduct, the culpable and reckless conduct that can be charged under the common law, and it appears not so much under the emergency legislation. First of all, is that correct? And if so, is there a reason for that? And are there any implications of that?
Well, I think there are many implications, if I may be so bold, Convener. Not least amongst them is the fact that legislators should be asking themselves whether the scope of the legislation goes as far as they wished it to extend in the first instance. I think there are some fundamental difficulties that present themselves when emergency legislation was brought in to deal with a particular set of circumstances. Individuals who are considered to have not complied with the restrictions that that legislation provides for find themselves charged under common law. It does suggest that there are judgments being made that the provisions of the legislation do not go far enough to cover the examples of behaviour that police officers are encountering. And of course, there are also examples which, for very obvious reasons, I hope you understand that I can't specifically go into, where it appears that individuals have not contravened the coronavirus regulations in any way, shape or form, but yet find themselves or have found themselves libelled under common law charges. That in its own right, kind of suggests that there has been an indirect expectation placed upon the police service, almost to police to some extent, to the guidance rather than the law.
Thank you for that. My final set of questions, my final questions rather, are directed to Mr. Smith and Ms. Watson in terms of the areas that they're speaking to today. And that is to ask whether they view any element of the emergency legislation should be retained in the long term in terms of how it affects disabled people or in terms of how it affects housing and homelessness. Can I ask that first to Mr. Smith and then Ms. Watson, please?
Thank you. In terms of disabled people, I think most of the provisions in the emergency legislation were about suspending existing legislation to now, because of the emergency, so that, for example, assessments for social work, care support, the provisions were, or power was there to suspend provision, the requirement for local authorities to do that in relation to Adults with Incapacity Act, which is still to be kept on the statute, was about suspending the time limits so that, or stopping the clock, so that people who were subject to a guardianship order could remain subject to a guardianship order for however long the situation remains. Now, I don't think there is any grounds for those provisions to be retained at all, but certainly not in the long term. We questioned at the time whether they were appropriate because they were serious breaches of attached to them. What I would say is that clearly that there may be different ways of delivering a service as a result of that we've learned about from COVID-19, and it may be that there needs to be some amendment to existing legislation to pick up the good things. For example, the fact that you can do hearings online rather than necessarily in a courtroom is not necessarily a bad thing, and it may be the legislation needs to be updated to take account of what we've learned that we can do from COVID-19. But certainly we should not be seeking to extend the existing restrictions that have been placed on human rights of disabled people.
Thank you. Ms. Watson?
As I said in my opening remarks, I do think we've got an opportunity here to apply some learning, particularly looking at the private rented sector and the provisions there. So we would certainly be recommending that we retain the pre-action requirements that are currently in place. This is about providing stronger rights for tenants, and I would say that in the context of a situation where, despite the eviction protection being in place, Shelter Scotland has continued to take calls from tenants in the private rented sector throughout the pandemic being threatened with eviction by their landlord. So there's a mismatch here between what the legislation says should be happening and what's happening on the ground, and I think we've got a real opportunity in the private rented sector in provisions to close that gap. This is about making sure that we just take that learning about making sure that there's nothing automatic that says if you've got rent arrears in the private rented sector, that should always trigger eviction. I think we're beginning to learn that we can take a different approach, and we would certainly recommend that be considered going forward.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to colleagues, and can I ask, first of all, Alec Rowley for his questions. Alec.
Okay, thank you, convener. If I can maybe start with Mr. Steele, and it may be Mr. Clancy wants to add to this, but I suppose my question would be about has the government got the balance right when it comes to policing because I do know that you say, Mr Steele, it's for others to decide whether this extension of police powers is something that is desirable, and if so, whether it should be conveyed by a mere dent of emergency regulations rather than through primary legislation. Can I ask, firstly, we obviously need to learn the lessons of this period before making those kind of considerations, but do you agree that it has to be measured, and that the more legislation, the more regulation, then the more difficult you could perhaps make it to police? And I've noticed the First Minister say quite a number of times that people need to be able to use common sense and use their common sense to stay within the rules. So my question would be, do you think the legislation that's there is effective enough, and or do you believe that the police need further powers? And specifically, moving forward, if we're going to move back into some kind of tiered system, does that make it more difficult or more resources called upon for the police? And do the police have enough resources to be able to deal with this pandemic and everything that's been asked of them?
Thank you, and through yourself, Convener, thanks, Mr Rowley, for those questions. If I can try and take them in reverse order, you'll not be surprised to hear that whenever anyone asks someone in the police if we want more resources, the answer is always going to be yes. But of course, that has to be struck against the balance as to what the public expect. And ultimately, the success or otherwise of the regulations from a policing perspective will be determined by, first of all, the willingness of people to comply with any sanctions that they may have encountered, and also whether it ultimately contributes towards the bringing down of the infection rates across the country. I suppose to some extent, one of the remarkable things about the proliferation of legislation is that the more legislation we got, the more offences we got. I suppose to some extent that's kind of inevitable. But when we faced restrictions, I think probably 12 months ago, just after mid-March, when we had no legislation, the public compliance was enormous. Now, we can obviously argue that fatigue and general boredom and being scunnered with the realities of life stuck at home all day did result in the requirement for legislation. But obviously, again, when we have situations that apply universally across the whole of the country, they are much easier to deal with than when we have fragmented arrangements that apply to different tiers, tiers 4, 3, 2 and 1, and the travel obligations and the travel expectations and restrictions that go with them. The policing of the stay at home, or to be more accurate, the not being outside of your home, is much easier than any of the other elements, simply because it is an explicit offence. Brackets, unless you have a reasonable excuse. So the starting point is that if you're outside of your home, you have committed an offence, subject to obviously the qualification that you might have a defence of a reasonable excuse. Thereafter, the ability to detect further offences relating to travel, relating to crossing between tiers, the reason for being out of your home, arguably presents some questions in terms of the rights of individuals not to self-incriminate, which is far from easy to deal with from a policing perspective when you're dealing with a set of restrictions that are applied across the whole of the country.
In terms of the expectations, I saw this morning an article in the Courier that Chief Superintendent Andrew Todd visited and spoke with a committee at Angus Council yesterday, and he actually states that we are finding a number in our community want us to do more and complain when we don't, and a number want us to do less and complain where we don't. Now, I have to say to you that generally I've felt that the public are totally behind the police in terms of the approach that the police have taken. But quite interestingly, the number of complaints in Tayside
Again, through yourself, Convener, in terms of the specifics of, and I think to some extent we're probably talking about house parties largely now, and the most prolific kind of examples that the police are called to attend to, there are actually breaches that take place across the length and breadth of the country. There is an increase in general non-compliance with those specific restrictions, and those examples of non-compliance are increasing amongst a relatively small proportion of the population who have just decided that they've had enough and they no longer intend to play by the rules. So I'm not sure that that's an urban versus rural problem. I think there is an inevitability that, by virtue of an appreciation that there are more police officers in our urban centres rather than our rural locations, that there's probably a greater expectation within our cities that if the public phone the police to attend to gatherings with individuals in population centres, that the police will be there, and probably more of a grudging acceptance that there's probably no point in phoning the police in some of the more rural areas, because by the time they get there, the whole thing will be finished. So I'm not sure it's an urban versus rural thing. I'm not sure there's anything particularly distinct in the psyche of those that live in our cities versus those that live in our rural communities about the levels of compliance. But just simply by strength and weight of numbers, we're going to see more of those type of incidents, even by pro rata numbers in our densely populated centres.
So as parliamentarians looking at this legislation, looking at an extension of legislation, the two sort of key questions I would say is, one, does the police have enough powers to be able to do the job that they're being asked to do? And secondly, do they have enough resources? I know you say that you will always say that we need more, but there's a different question there. Do they have enough resources, given certainly the shift in what they're being asked to do? But I'd imagine the increasing pressures on all police officers. Do they have the resources to be able to do that we are asking them to? And do they have the powers that we're asking them to use?
Again, and through yourself, Convener, again, I'm grateful for the question. In terms of the issue of powers, and I am mindful of the fact that it is, this is not a cop-out, I assure you, it is for parliamentarians to some extent to put a check on the powers that the police have and that the police use. But if you're asking me about whether there are some deficiencies in the law as it currently exists in terms of the expectation that the law places on police officers, then the answer to that is yes. I think there are some very obvious difficulties that present themselves with powers of entry into houses. And I've laid an illustration of that out in my written submission. I do think there are some difficulties around the requirements to provide information when you're dealing with the travel and associated offences, without potentially coming into conflict with the right to not self-incriminate. I do think that those areas could be looked at. I think it's also important to highlight, Mr. Riley, that the police service has not stopped dealing with all of the things that it's been asked to do simply because of coronavirus. There was a momentary lull in the very early days. I think that maybe lasted for 4 to 6 weeks, where there was a definite downturn in call demand being placed upon the police service. But that's come back with gusto. So, the police service is currently dealing with exceptional levels of demand. And that is compounded by the realities of the fact that we have this pandemic. And it's further compounded by looking at events that are going to be placing further pressure on the service throughout the year, not least amongst them the forthcoming COP26 summit to Glasgow in November, and the requirements of the service to prepare and increase certain levels of training exponentially, which by extension removes police officers from the tasks that they require to do in order to prepare for those kind of events. So whilst I may have glibly said that, I'll always going to say that the police service could do with more resources. Genuinely, the police service could do with more resources. But I suspect that Ms Forbes would argue that with the funding that's being provided for the service, and Mr Yousaf would take the same view also, that the maintenance of the status quo is probably as good as we're going to get just now.
Okay, thank you. Could I very quickly, Convener, just one question in terms of housing for Alison Watson. I know that locally I can see myself the major impact that the social housing sector virtually closed down in many areas, and the lack of transfers and allocations, etc. Do we need some kind of national recovery plan that will coordinate with each of the local authority areas to get social housing moving again?
I think you make a very good point. We are very concerned that we've now got over 14,000 households effectively trapped in temporary accommodation, and that's increased by 22% during the pandemic. Even before the pandemic, the figure was already at a record high. Now, that tells us there's tremendous pressure in the system. Coupled with that, we've also got concerns about a lack of suitable accommodation that people are being placed in during the pandemic. It's great that people are being housed, but as I said in opening remarks, being housed is not a home, and hotels are certainly not a home. And I think particularly in our two largest cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh, we've still got literally hundreds of people being housed in hotels, and we're really struggling to see the flow of accommodation to take them out of those hotels and give them permanent accommodation. Church of Scotland's been calling for a short-term temporary accommodation task force, because this pandemic has revealed a problem that was already something that was so significant, which is this backlog of demand. So we've got, as a central pillar of the Scottish Government's agenda on ending homelessness, rapid rehousing. And in effect, rapid rehousing is still stuck on the starting blocks because we cannot get the supply issue sorted. We still cannot get the flow of lets to homeless households. And until that's tackled, the policy agenda in its broadest terms doesn't move forward. And then we don't deal with the additional pressures that have come through the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. I think my time's up, but I'm sure others will pick up on that answer. Thank you, Convener.
Thanks, Alec. I turn next to Beatrice Wishart. Beatrice.
Thanks, Convener. And I'd like to address my first question to Ms Watson, please. And Mr Smith may want to come in at the end of it as well. Domestic abuse is a major cause of women's homelessness in Scotland, and earlier in the pandemic, Scottish Women's Aid warned that increased risks for emergency accommodation coincided with a reduction in their capacity due to distancing requirements and delays in being able to move individuals to more permanent homes. Are there any groups of people like domestic abuse victims who need more support as a result of the pandemic and as we continue through and come out the other side? I mean, you referenced early on about applying learning through this process. So I wondered if you had any indication of other groups that need additional support.
That has been a very welcome measure taken during the pandemic is to make sure that people who otherwise would have been rough sleeping are housed. Now, in the main, that is about people being accommodated in hotels in Edinburgh and Glasgow and some other locations. I think there's a lot of success in terms of taking that as an opportunity to say, here's a group of people that are now in one place, we can build relationships with them, we can understand what the issues are and work with them to make sure that the right support is put in place so that they can sustain accommodation going forward. Our concern would be that that's not happening for everyone. And I think particularly people who've got more complex needs, and I'm thinking in particular of people who've got substance misuse issues, We are certainly also aware of some women in hotels who have had a background in sexual abuse, had a background in domestic abuse, as you're talking about. And what we see is a system struggling to cope, to put enough support in place that we avoid a situation where, in effect, we're bringing together in these hotels a large number of people who have very significant vulnerabilities. And that feels to us dangerous in the context of not then having sufficient support nor sufficient accommodation to move people onto. So I think whilst there has been some real success there, it's not happening at sufficient volume. And then, of course, there's the issue about, well, what happens when we feel that the emergency measures can be withdrawn? If we can't accommodate people just now, there's a danger that we just see a dramatic spike in rough sleeping when the emergency protections and the investment that makes that possible, if that's removed. And it goes back to my earlier comments about just a real need to make sure that there isn't a cliff edge. So I think it's recognising the extent of the opportunity that we've got to act, but we need to understand what's currently working at the moment and where what we're seeing is overstretched resources simply not being able to cope and reach everybody.
That's helpful. Mr. Smith, I wondered if you had any response on that issue about vulnerable groups that might need further assistance and support at this time with housing.
Not specifically on housing. I think there are clearly a number of issues, and I could go on all day about the amount of additional support that disabled people need. On housing, I suspect one of the big issues is actually making sure that people are actually living in a suitable accommodation in terms of aids and adaptations, which I'm sure have been impacted by the crisis. People living in accommodation which is crowded, which makes it more difficult for social isolation and issues like that. There are general issues in relation to the benefits system, where people can't get access to advice and support, which they would usually get from making applications for benefits, and that may impact on their housing costs as well, because they're not getting access to the support they need to meet their housing costs. So I think that, in general, disabled people who perhaps find it more difficult to access services in normal times will find it even more difficult to access those services during the current COVID pandemic, and in particular because many disabled people are less likely to be online, have access to online services because of whether it's poverty or because of the need for adaptations to adapted equipment to be able to get online, or simply the fact that they live in areas which don't have adequate broadband, which does impact quite a lot of disabled people, and particularly in rural and remote communities, as I'm sure you're aware, Beatrice.
Absolutely, yeah. No, thank you for that. Could I go back to Ms Watson and ask about student accommodation? I mean, we know that student finances were particularly hard hit, and there's been reports just this week of more students using food banks. So a significant financial burden for students was the need to pay rent, and many with private landlords have not been able to get rebates. So do you think that the guidance and regulations were sufficiently clear for students in short-term accommodation for the second lockdown? And do you think the renewal of the legislation provides sufficient protection for students in the event of another lockdown?
I mean, to take the second part of your question first, I do think we should see a continuing protection for students, particularly to enable them to terminate their leases with 28 days notice. We're very far from being out of the woods yet, and I think we've seen the volatility of the crisis and how that's impacted students in particular. I think the point that you're making about is there enough in place to support students, I think there's probably a more general point I would make there about what we've seen throughout the pandemic at Shelter Scotland is that in general terms, nobody seems to know enough about their rights. So we're calling for a broad-based awareness-raising campaign to make sure that people are really clear what rights they now have and know where they can get support to make sure that those rights are consistently enforced. And I would very much include students in that. I think a lot of what students are experiencing is very significant confusion about what their rights are and who they can go to help them fulfil those rights. But students aren't alone in that. I think there's a lot of groups, talked about people in the private rented sector earlier on, where been having a huge proportion of our calls to our national helpline coming from renters in the private rented sector, genuinely confused about what rights they have. And I think an awareness raising campaign in the context of this is a pandemic that is very far from over, I think would be very welcome.
I think you make a good point there, especially as we go into another academic year, and it'll catch up with us pretty soon. Could I turn to Mr Clancy? I just would like to ask about the Scottish Government messaging on the legislation and how people have been able to understand what they can and can't do. I wonder if there's anything obvious that you think could be improved in getting messages across to the public.
That's a very interesting question, and I don't have any statistical information about the extent to which people have understood or not the government messaging. But from our perspective, looking at it in our committees, it seems to be pretty reasonable communication. It's the messaging occurs in various ways. It is both in those ministerial briefings which happen, and frequently it's the First Minister, sometimes it's the Cabinet Secretary for Health. As you know, that's a good way to convey information to people about the current state of play. There's a significant online presence of information. The guidances are online. The legislation is online, but we've talked about the difficulties about how that gels. And I think it's fair to say that the general public are pretty law-abiding. So therefore, when a law is passed, most people will say, yes, that's the law, and I will abide by it. And I accept the issues which Callum Steele has referred to about people who go out of their way not to comply with the law. But we will always have some people who will do that. But I get the sense that generally speaking, most people abide by the law. And that implies that the message is getting through. So have I any particular silver bullet to be able to get this information to people in a more usable way? If I did, it's likely that I would be doing something else this morning. But clearly, to use all the media at the government's disposal is the best way forward. To tailor the media to different categories of person, to young people, to children, to the elderly, to make sure that there is a constant flow, and also to give people as much notice in as accessible language as possible, so that they are able to grasp what's happening and figure out how to comply. I think that those would be my words of guidance on this point, Ms. Bishop.
Thanks, Mr Clancy. I was going to ask Mr Steele to come in, but I see Mr Smith has put R in the chat. Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Just to add to that, in terms of communications, I think it's very important that we ensure that accessible communications are at the centre of this, to ensure that people who have other communication needs, such as BSL, Easy Read, or whatever, actually are getting access to information as well, because quite often that is forgotten about. One thing just to say that we were very pleased that very early on that the Scottish Government acceded to our request to have BSL translators at the daily briefings, something the UK Government still failed to do. But there's still an issue about communications not being in formats which are accessible to all disabled people. And one other point is I don't think anyone can remember what FACTS actually stands for, apart from Jason Leach.
Mr Steele, do you have any comment on the messaging?
Thank you, and through yourself, Convener. I mean, I think, Ms Wishart, if I may, the way in which the messaging is delivered, I don't think anyone can criticise. The one thing that specific to my area and the individuals I represent is the difficulties that inevitably present themselves when the messaging and the legislation do not strictly align. But I would go as far as to say that the biggest difficulty that police officers face has actually been the inelegant nature in which how the legislation has been presented. I defy anyone with moderate computer skills to navigate the legislation website to try and find out specifically what provisions apply in any area at any time. And if they do, I imagine they'll be applying for jobs in the Parliament in the near future.
Thanks, Mr. Steele. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you, Beatrice. Our next questions come from Stuart McMillan. Stuart, please.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. Just got a few questions, certainly for Michael Clancy. But I think just before I do start, I think it's important just regarding Mr. Smith's comment of facts. I think it's important to put on record that wear face coverings, avoid crowded places, clean your hands regularly, the 2 metre distance, and self-isolate and book a test if you have symptoms. But the first question for Michael Clancy is regarding the volume of legislation, particularly the secondary legislation. And as somebody who was a member of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for a few years in this session, also in the previous session, I generally have a healthy respect for the work of that committee, and also for those who are involved in preparing the secondary legislation. And when you look at also what's happened, certainly about this coronavirus, 86 made affirmative pieces, 34 negative, 11 draft, and 3 laid only. And this is also after the huge amount of work and legislation because of Brexit. So with that, would Michael Clancy suggest that when we get to a point of considering the effects of COVID and how the parliamentary scrutiny has actually taken place, would he recommend that the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee commission potentially maybe a specific piece of work, or the Parliament asks the DPLR committee to maybe look at the effects of the legislation, the secondary legislation in particular, and then potentially have some other type of activity surrounding the work of that committee over the course of the effects of the last 12 months.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. McMillan. You're not alone in commending the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee for the sterling work they do. It's a fashion in legislation that primary legislation, acts of the Scottish Parliament, frequently loan the lawmaking powers to Scottish ministers, and that those are implemented through a range of regulatory powers, which the DPLR certainly struggles, but successfully struggles to scrutinise properly and do their very best to make sure that the law is compliant with the Parent Act, etc. Our broad themes for dealing with legislation, if you don't mind a slight digression before I get to the meat of your question, was that there should be adequate parliamentary scrutiny to uphold the rule of law when making legislation in respect of coronavirus. And the broad regulation making powers, which we have seen in, let's say, the Coronavirus Scotland Act, Section 41, and the Number 2 Act, Section 11 rather, and the Coronavirus Number 2 Act in Section 14. And these deal with significant new powers to deal with the coronavirus pandemic. Parliamentary scrutiny of the legislation was not of the ordinary standard which we would expect when dealing with primary legislation in the Scottish context, but it was certainly a lot better than the UK Parliament's consideration of the Coronavirus Act, which was passed then, taking all its stages in the House of Commons in one day, for example, on the 23rd of March last year. But even so, we could do better in the future when making legislation which affects public health and emergency circumstances. The key to good lawmaking, as I've said before, about the practicality, the consistency, the clarity, the accessibility, a lot of that comes from adequate pre-legislative consultation. And in order to do that, we have to know what the government is prepared to be thinking about, so that it is able to issue consultation documents and get people's views from a broad range of stakeholders. And people around the table today, in a figurative sense, represent some of those voices. I think we were also concerned about respect for human rights in dealing with this legislation, because, of course, lots of the provisions of the Acts and the subordinate legislation certainly intrude on some of our fundamental rights, and they engage the Convention in a number of ways: criminal justice sphere, in the freedom of movement, and in a right to a family life. So I think we've got to be aware that human rights has to be front and foremost in our consideration going forward, and that is also to take account of the competence provisions of the Parliament. So getting to subordinate legislation, you're absolutely correct. 130 Scottish statutory instruments, 132 Scottish statutory instruments at the time of writing of our briefing, and I think that even one of those orders, which is before the committee today, the Coronavirus Scotland Act's Early Expiry and Suspension of Provisions Regulations 2021, that's number 93, is a made affirmative regulation. So therefore, the fact that it comes already made, it presents the Scottish Parliament with a difficulty. Can we have enough scrutiny of a piece of legislation that is already effective, essentially, although the coming into force of it might be not for some time yet? I think that leads me to the issue of the extent to which the subordinate legislation is used and the bulk of it. There have been 22 Scottish statutory instruments since the turn of the year, also 25 regulations amending the health protection international travel, Scotland Regulations 2020 across the piece. So what we're dealing with, of course, is the product of government trying to catch up with the movement of the virus, and trying to be flexible enough, agile enough to be able to deal with these issues as they appear, as the spread of the disease, as scientific and virologist expertise is applied to that, as the mapping of those who are unwell. So I think it's quite important that we bear that in mind, that this is an extraordinary situation, but I think we can do better, and we suggest that there should be a general review of public health legislation, particularly in the context of emergencies. The question as to why the Civil Contingencies Act 2004 was not deployed is a one over which people still argue, and I think we have to settle on what the law is by having something which is fit for purpose for the 21st century, which is agile enough to deal with a fast-moving situation, and yet at the same time satisfies those elements of proper legislative scrutiny and pre-legislative scrutiny. Definitely the LRP, Delegated Powers and Law Reform, DPLR Committee, should be engaged in looking at something which sketches the landscape for the future. We have to bear in mind that the Audit Committee has a post-legislative function as well for scrutiny, and perhaps there could be some way in which both of those committees could engage with this issue, bringing the pre-legislative and subordinate legislation skills of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee to the post-legislative scrutiny role which the Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee has.
No, thank you for that, Mr. Clancy. Second question is I'll go to Callum Steele, if I may. Mr. Steele, you spoke about COP26 earlier, and also if things go to plan, we still have Euro 21 to take place in Glasgow. And you also spoke about resources. Do you believe that that Police Scotland will be able to fully deal with the reopening of society, COP26, the Euro 21s in the summer, as I said, as society begins to reopen as we go forward in the coming months?
Thanks, and again, through yourself, Convener. The short answer, particularly in terms of COP26, is not on its own. But I don't think that should surprise anyone, and that's not an admission of shortcoming on the part of the Police Service of Scotland. It's simply the sheer scale certainly the potential sheer scale of the event is going to require policing resources from across the United Kingdom to be drawn into Glasgow, and again, particularly as the progress on the vaccination programme accelerates. I think there's an ever-increasing belief that the size of that event is only going to grow with the success of the vaccination programme as people have confidence to travel to the event. In terms of the other activities, the short answer is, of course, the police service will manage it. But obvious questions are whether the police service is able to manage them to the best effect that they should or that they would were it not for coronavirus. And the biggest challenge that presents itself to the service at this particular point in time is when it comes to specific forms of activities that police officers undertake that has to be delivered to a standard that is accredited, often by reference to the College of Policing in England, and often in the most high-risk areas of policing. So, for example, public order, security escort driving, firearms activities, so on and so forth. And because of the physical limitations that are placed upon the service in terms of capacity, that's human capacity and physical capacity in buildings, etc., and the manner in which training is being delivered, at this particular point in time, our preparations, with the best will in the world, are being hindered because of the virus. There are discussions that are taking place separately with the Scottish Government in terms of whether those particular forms of training should be prioritised for consideration in the vaccine programme, for example, which would make the service much more agile and able to respond, and certainly remove a fairly healthy chunk of risk from the police service in that regard. But I think as a police service, we've shown time and again that almost regardless of what it is that is thrown at us, whether that is weather-related emergencies and disasters through to significant terrorist incidents or other type of major crime, mass public order. We've had the Commonwealth Games. We've had the G8 in the past. The service is in good shape numerically to be able to respond to the vast majority of what is being asked of it. But because of the reality of the virus and what it means for how we prepare, that is a very limiting and significantly hindering factor at this point in time.
Okay, thank you. Just one final question for you, Mr. Steele. Are you satisfied that there's an appropriate testing regime in place for frontline police officers? Okay. And are you able to provide a committee with any numbers and frequency of tests that have been carried out?
This has been a hoary old chestnut within the service, and without being too indiscreet, it's actually been a point of significant conflict. And to some extent, I have a significant degree of sympathy for the Chief Constable in this regard, because I suspect his ability to furnish the access to testing is limited by the general availability of testing in the round. I think one of the issues that has been most, I'm not going to say ignored, but certainly most forgotten about, is the fact that Parliament legislated to put police officers in positions where they have to intervene in what have been recognised as high-risk situations. Despite that, there was not a corresponding testing regime to identify the risk of exposure to officers as a consequence of attending those incidents, which in turn would also help inform the policing response and also inform the public health response as to whether there were risks thereafter being introduced to subsequent engagement with members of the public. There has been the introduction of some lateral flow testing very recently across a small part of the police service. To our view, that does not go anywhere near far enough. The vast majority of response officers that will tonight, last night, and every night during the course of the month that will be attending parties generally do not have access to testing. There is, to some extent, testing on request, but that, and certainly that's improved over the past number of weeks. But in general, I do think that the exposure to police officers, and by extension thereafter to the general public, as well as the police officer's family, could have been mitigated more with more strident and more frequent testing.
Okay, no, thank you. And one very final question for everyone. When do the panellists think that a review of the legislation of the last 12 months should take place? I'll go to Alison Watson first.
Feels like a very big question and a hard one to answer when we are still very much in the pandemic and when the Scottish Government is taking a very cautious view of how we will wind back from the pandemic. It certainly feels like there's an opportunity to capture a lot of learning, very much on the housing side, and my previous comments probably echoed that. And I think we would be doing ourselves a great disservice to not capture that learning. I think we probably need at least another 3 to 6 months before we're at a place where we can really start to do the look back and capture that learning. My concern would be, are we capturing the right data now to inform that evaluation as we start to wind the measures back? So that is a significant concern and a question that I would raise.
Okay, no, thank you. Mr. Smith?
As I indicated in my opening remarks, I believe the time has already passed for that review to happen. The emergency legislation was brought in largely on the basis of not knowing how the virus was going to impact in a lot of areas. And I think there has been lessons and learning that already over the last year, which could have been brought forward to update the legislation to be more appropriate. And in particular, too little account was taken of the needs of disabled people in planning on how to deal with coronavirus, and disabled people and their representative organisations have not been included in the contingency planning processes. And I think the legislation needs to be reviewed and amended to take account of that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Steele?
Thank you, and again to yourself, Camilla. I agree with Ian Smith. I believe the time has long since passed for the review of the legislation. That being said, by virtue of the fact we're having this meeting today and these questions are being asked, I suppose to some extent that points to some form of review in its own right. There is a temptation to be slightly flippant and say that the 6th of May would be a good day to start the review of the legislation, but I'll I'm not sure that will be particularly helpful. But I do believe that Parliament is probably constrained by just the realities of time, particularly with the forthcoming elections. But given the range of issues, a bit like the old advert for your solicitor, it's probably never too early to start the review, particularly given, I think, a number of factors. One, we're coming to better weather. I think there is a general increase in fatigue amongst the general public to facing restrictions. And I don't think it will be particularly helpful to be dealing with a public that is hungry for freedom and release to be continually dealt with through what are seen to be rolling over of emergency provisions. I think some early attention to the realities of human nature should come into the thinking, and hopefully before Parliament rises.
Okay, thank you. And Mr. Clancy.
Thank you very much, Ms Macmillan. The issue of plane is an imponderable. I think the difficulties which Mr Steele indicated over the timing because of the election period nearly upon us, with the recess later this month, the issue about the new government and what its priorities are going to be. These are factors which are political rather than legal, but clearly, even if some might say the time is already past for a review, that does not prevent us from having a review to commence at some point in the future. Probably at a time when issues around about the disease and its spread have been stable for some time, when there is sufficient capability of connecting with the health and virological community about what sort of learning they have. I'm sure that academics in our universities are clearly going to be thinking about the impact of the coronavirus on their various topics and subjects. So therefore, some kind of literature review might be undertaken by the Parliament between now and the commencement of the new session, and something, of course, which in this committee's legacy paper it will want to emphasise is the need for our future lawmaking in this area to be evidence-based. We didn't have evidence before. We can make it in the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Convener.
Thank you for that. Before I turn to Mark Ruskell, can I just clarify, in terms of our witnesses, I know that Mr. Clancy has to leave at 11, but can I ask Mr. Steele, Mr. Smith and Ms. Watson about their availability beyond 11? Are you all okay to carry on? Because we are taking slightly longer than expected.
Yes, indeed.
Alison,
okay.
Thank you. Ian, you're okay to carry on?
Yes.
Convener, I have an 11 o'clock, but the next time the camera's off me, I can easily push that back 15 minutes.
That would be helpful. Okay. Can I turn then to Mark Ruskell?
Yeah, thanks, Convener, and morning, everybody. Callum Steele, can I just come to you first? I'm just picking up on your comments there about testing within the police, workplace testing. My understanding that in the government announced last week, there was a commitment in there, in particular to testing frontline officers who are working in emergency control rooms. But that seemed to be the extent of it in terms of specifically identifying a workplace testing strategy for those working in the emergency services. Can you just sort of clarify then what is the testing regime at the moment within the police? I mean, you seem to be suggesting earlier it's just a bit, random and it's test on request rather than a specific policy over regular asymptomatic testing?
Yes, thank you. And again, through yourself, Convener, I mean, that description is accurate. The expansion of testing to emergency control rooms seems to be a policy decision that has been taken by government across all of the emergency services. My understanding is that also extends to fire and ambulance control, for example. And whilst that is welcome, because let's be honest, we can't afford for those that answer the telephones to go down like dominoes, it does not deal with the realities of the pressures and the vulnerabilities that the police officers that are going through doors and attending mass gatherings are concerned with. Like I say, I have said previously, I think in response to Mr McMillan, there has been some improvement in terms of the ability to access testing. But generally, it is where officers are symptomatic or believe that they're symptomatic, and the ability to request and access tests is available to them. We don't believe as an organisation that goes far enough. We think that organisationally, and I also think politically, because there has been a legislative intent that police officers place themselves in these high-risk situations, that there should be a support mechanism and a safety mechanism to ensure that as a consequence of having done so, that police officers are not exposed to virus and thereafter taking it to others and exposing others to that virus as a consequence. So if we were to get to a situation, and I think we're long overdue it, my very strong view is that a testing regime that at least covers every police officer that has been to any gathering, internal gathering in particular, should be available, probably within a number of days after the event, and thereafter a number of days after that again, just to make sure that nothing was missed.
Okay. So the kind of testing regime that teachers have at the moment, for example, where they're getting regularly tested every single week with a lateral flow test, I think twice a week actually in some, that isn't something that you would argue for, or is it just under certain circumstances? You say if officers are attending mass gatherings, then they can make a judgment?
I am an inherent libertarian, which might surprise some people. So I don't believe in anything that tends to the degree of compulsion. But my belief is that if the ability to get testing was available to the police service, that the vast majority, probably down to almost single-digit objections, would participate in a testing regime similar to that applied to or available to teachers. I mean, very obviously, not every single member of the police service is working in police buildings and in police stations and in these kind of environments. So if it was simply in terms of capacity and where the area of greatest risk was, I would say that those that are attending the calls should be front and centre. But very obviously, in terms of the wider resilience in the service, if it was able to go much wider, then there's no way we would object to that in any way, shape or form.
Okay, thanks for that. And just sticking with yourself, can I ask you about the review that John Scott QC has been undertaking in relation to the use of the powers that the police have under the COVID regulations? How has that been panning out? Has that been constructive for yourselves? I haven't seen any conclusions from that at this point.
Mr. Scott reports to the Scottish Police Authority on a regular basis, and whilst I'm sure that individuals have a massive interest in the activities of the Scottish Police Authority, they can attend and view all of his contributions online. I think that much the same way as the Parliament has all of its video content available online, the Scottish Police Authority does likewise. I mean, in general, his review and those assisting with his review have been very complimentary in the police approach, and have highlighted, certainly his last contribution to the authority last week, highlighted some areas of myth that he was capable of bursting about those that were disproportionately affected or seemed to be disproportionately affected versus what the data actually showed. He was fairly critical in some areas of the legislative approach, which I think it would be unfair on me to try to paraphrase, but it is available for anyone to go and have a look at.
Okay, thanks. Just finally, for yourself, we touched a bit on testing, but there were previous concerns that you raised about PPE, and obviously in the context where, as a workforce, you're not going to be prioritised for the vaccine. You just have to wait for the age cohorts to work their way through officers. Do you have any current concerns about PPE?
In terms of availability at this particular point in time, I would say no. But I would also say that that's a relatively new position. The concern about PPE prevailed for a long period of time, certainly over the early days of the pandemic. And we did have a strange situation that certainly the analysis showed that we were using more of our, I'll describe it as high-risk PPE over the summer months when the virus was in abeyance than we were when we started the second wave, when it was in an increase. So that in its own right was an area of concern. But there are some internal issues in respect of the use of PPE, which without being unkind, I don't think it would be appropriate to raise at this committee, unless, of course, members feel that they need to press it.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's tempting, but I need to move on. But perhaps if you could write to the committee with those, that'd be. Can I then just turn to Alison Watson then? So, in terms of housing and evictions and the evictions ban, that a number of my colleagues have really been sort of pushing for over recent months. I mean, there is the option of saying, okay, well, we could make a winter evictions ban a permanent feature of housing policy. But I wanted to ask you, do we have a model for that? Because you might have heard some of the concerns the First Minister raised about whether having a winter evictions ban effectively creates a cliff edge where as soon as the ban's over, people then get evicted. I mean, I suppose there would also be some concerns about the build-up of debt as well over that period. Do you think there's a workable model there going forward that should be adopted?
I've said a couple of times that we absolutely need to avoid that cliff edge. I think it's been extremely welcome for renters that the eviction ban is in place. I think we also need to recognise it doesn't cover everyone. So, for example, if an eviction action was raised against you before the start of the emergency protections, going back to early April last year, those cases have been proceeding through our courts. So I think it's taking the learning from what's currently happening to see, is it comprehensive enough? And I suppose, yes, evictions during winter, that is particularly welcome, but I think there's an opportunity for us to be more progressive here. And Scotland has a fantastic track record on housing rights. We have internationally recognised housing rights. They are the most progressive housing rights in the world. So I think there's an opportunity to say, through the lens of those progressive rights, how do we want evictions to be managed, particularly in the social rented sector going forward? And you mentioned rent arrears there. That is a very particular and very acute concern. So I've mentioned the figures that have recently come from the Scottish Housing Regulator indicating that we've got over £160 million worth of rent arrears, and that's just in the social rented sector. Very difficult to quantify that in the private rented sector. There's been some fantastic research done by Joseph Rowntree Foundation recently highlighting that well over a third of renters are in the industries that are most impacted. So I think there's a real sense for us of the worst is still to come, unfortunately, for a lot of people who rent. So I don't think we can have the ending of eviction measures just when we come out of lockdown. I think we need to understand what is the full extent of the economic fallout and consequences for people in terms of jobs and income going forward before we can make any definite measures. But I think there's a real opportunity to stay here as a progressive nation with progressive housing rights. Where are the arguments for ever evicting people simply on the grounds of rent arrears when we have such fantastic examples of good practice, both in our local authorities and in registered social landlords, examples of good practice where if you make changes like intervening early when somebody is only starting to get into difficulty, if you put money and debt advice in place for people, if you put benefits advice in place for people, if you put these measures in place, you can stop the eviction happening in the first place. And we also know from landlords that evictions are a very costly business for them. They can cost between £10,000 to £15,000, we understand, for the full cost of an eviction. So what's the best use of public money here? Is it to take people through a legal process which is only going to leave them homeless, and we still have a responsibility as a nation to that person who is homeless? Or is it to say, let's put everything in place to help them keep a roof over their head? So I think there's an opportunity to take the learning from what we're doing at the moment, which is progressive, but say, let's not just stop that at the end of the pandemic, partly because of the long-term economic impact, but I think that is right and fitting for the progressive nation that we want to be in terms of our housing rights.
Yeah, thanks very much. We need to see it much more as a fundamental human right rather than it being all about property rights, I think. Just finally, can I move to Ian Smith? Ian, obviously one of the major impacts on people with disability during this pandemic has been the cancellation of medical appointments. I'm just wondering if we've got a clear handle on the data on that and what the impact of those cancellations have been, and whether you think the government is really factoring that into the recovery. Because I'm certainly seeing in my constituency caseload a lot of people who are really struggling, who are just waiting months and months and months now for medical interventions that aren't coming.
I don't think we have any specific data on that. We do know from our surveys that we have done with disabled people across Scotland and most recently just in the Highlands that access to medical services is a key concern for disabled people, not just being able to physically access the GP, but the loss of services which they rely on, support groups, clinics, pain relief, as a whole range of the ancillary services that the NHS provide, which have been more difficult to access and can be accessed online. I mentioned earlier also about disabled people not having necessarily the access to the internet in the same way as others. So some of the online services that are being provided as an alternative to physical meetings aren't available to some disabled people. Transport is an issue, which makes it more difficult for disabled people in rural communities again to get to services, partly because of shielding and so on. They can't use public transport. And they may not have access to their own car. So there's a whole raft of areas where disabled people have found it more difficult to access their health. It's resulted in a deterioration in their health, but also issues in relation to mental health. I think it is a big concern. I don't think enough work is being done by the Scottish Government to monitor the impact on disabled people of COVID-19. We've been struggling to get them to even take account of in terms of the statistics on deaths or admissions to hospital as a result of COVID-19, to get them to take account of disability as one of the factors to address. We don't have any statistics even on that. So it is a big issue, and I think the Scottish Government does need to work with disabled people's organisations to take more account of the needs of disabled people when they're drawing up statistics.
Okay, thanks very much. Back to you, convener.
Thank you very much. So given the time pressures, and I know that two of our witnesses, Mr. Clancy and then Mr. Steele, may need to leave quite soon, I am going to ask for questions for Mr. Clancy, first of all. And can I first turn to Maurice Corrie for a question for Mr. Clancy, and then I'll go to Annabel Ewing and then Mr. Steele. Sorry, and then John Mason.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, panel. This is a question for Mr. Clancy. Mr. Clancy, the response to the pandemic has operated on a four-nation basis. Is there anything we can learn from the legislative process and its scrutiny from Cardiff, Belfast and Westminster?
It's something which we have suggested, Mr. Corrie, in our submission, that there should be some kind of inter-parliamentary group which allows for the development of best practice across all the legislatures within the UK. And I think that worked with varying degrees of success, but certainly was considered to be very useful during the Brexit negotiations, where there was an interparliamentary group which involved Lord McFall, his position as Deputy Lord Speaker, getting representatives from the Scottish Parliament, the Welsh Assembly or Senate, and the Northern Ireland Assembly together. So that might be a way in which the Scottish Parliament can share its good practice with others and hopefully get some benefit of learning from them.
So if I may just ask one quick one on this, so therefore there's been no progress on that?
You would have to ask the parliamentary authorities. I haven't seen any inter-parliamentary discussions, but that doesn't mean to say that they're not taking place out of public gaze.
Right, thank you, Mr. President. Back to you, convener.
Annabel Ewing.
Thanks, convener. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, so obviously time is marching on a lot. So the questions I probably wanted to ask, I'll just pare back. So to Michael Clancy, obviously I should declare my entry in the Register of Interest, wherein people will note that I am a member of the Law Society of Scotland. I hold a current practicing certificate, albeit that I am not currently practicing. Michael Clancy, I had two questions. Obviously, time is brief for you to probably give a fulsome response, but perhaps just a kind of top-line summary would do. First of all, the coronavirus pandemic and the approach taken in terms of the emergency legislation and so forth, what impact do you feel that's had on the rule of law in Scotland? Second, what alternative would there be at this stage, given all the circumstances, the fact we're still in lockdown, the pandemic is still very much there, we're about to go into recess and so on, and there'll be a new parliament elected on the 6th of May. What would be the alternative to proceeding with an extension at this stage of the emergency legislation to 30 September 2021? Thank you.
I think to answer the first question, I'll take that secondly. Your second question about what alternatives are there in relation to the legislation, I do not believe there are any alternatives. The coronavirus acts are quite clear. There is expiry at the 30th of September 2021. So therefore, for them, those provisions to survive, they have to be extended. And I think that that would strike me as being pretty clear. No doubt someone will have an alternative view. On the other, what was the impact on the rule of law? Well, of course, I'm going to define the rule of law here as issues relating to the justice system, and particularly ensuring that those who are accused of having committed crime are dealt with promptly, and the victims are satisfied, and that the courts can operate. So, of course, as you know, and as the other members of the committee know, there has been a significant disruption to the operation of the criminal and civil justice systems in the country. We're delighted that High Court trials are back on, and the Society has participated in trying to provide its expertise to, for example, the Scottish Government, the Cabinet Secretary for Justice, and the court system. We appear as members of various working groups in that connection. In the context of the government's policy, which is emerging to recover, renew and transform the justice system, we certainly want to be frontline participants in that. And I think that means being members of the Criminal Justice Board and the Advisory Board, which supports that from an independent standpoint. We're not at the moment, and I would hope that this committee could make that plea that the Law Society of Scotland should be so included. We've done a lot of good work in this area. The idea for using cinemas as courts was one which emerged from our jury trials working group, and we were delighted to support solicitors in Dumfries and the faculty of solicitors there in terms of the changes which are going to be coming, which the Scottish Courts and Tribunal Service announced yesterday, and which saves people from going to AIR in person for court cases. So there's quite a lot going on. We want to participate. We think we have done a good job so far. The impact on solicitors, of course, is very significant. Their businesses have, in many cases, been very badly affected by the coronavirus legislation and the lockdowns. We are grateful to the government for its fund to assist primarily legal aid lawyers, legal aid solicitors, but more has to be done in terms of resources, the opportunity for time to be given for legislation concerning legal aid and other matters like that. But we can write to the committee about these things in the very near future, if you would like.
Thank you very much, Michael Clancy, and very interesting proposals there, and I'm sure the committee would be happy to receive any submission you wish to make. I think, convener, you're now going to somebody else, another colleague, to allow them to ask Michael a question.
I was going to, if you've got any further questions for Michael, please feel free to ask them now.
I've got a question for Callum, but I think somebody else wants to ask Michael, and he's got to go first, so perhaps we could go to that colleague.
Yes, thank you. John, I think you've got a question for Mr. Clancy before he goes.
Yes, thanks, Convener. I'm grateful for that. Really a kind of follow-up, I think, to Annabel Ewing's questions. I mean, on the backlog in the courts, it had been suggested previously we should go ahead with court cases without juries. And I wonder, in retrospect, was it a mistake to not do that? And I mean, can we speed up the backlog and catching up with the court cases? I mean, sometimes I feel we're always looking for a gold standard, but maybe to speed things up, could we go for a silver standard?
The standard is the extent to which we comply with human rights, Mr. Mason. And I don't need to tell the committee the articles of the European Convention, which are engaged when you get to criminal justice matters, Articles 5 and 6 about liberty and security and fair trials. And it's on the basis of making sure that the trials for the most serious matters are fair. And I think the Lord Justice General has been quite clear about that. The proposals to remove the jury were met with universal disdain. It would put at risk some of those principles which we hold most dear. And I think that it was the right thing to do for the government to think again on that. I think the important aspect is the resources which are made available in the renewal part and the transformatory part of the Scottish Government's Recover, Renew and Transform policy. That's where we need to be looking for improvements in the justice system rather than taking a look at what we can pare off from the existing arrangements.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Thanks.
Thank you. Can I thank Michael Clancy for his evidence this morning and for staying on slightly beyond the time that he indicated he had to leave. I'm next going to turn to. Thank you. I'm next going to turn to Callum Steele, who also requires to leave shortly, and again in the same order, take questions for him specifically. Can I ask, first of all, Maurice Corrie for your questions for Callum Steele? Maurice.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, good morning, Callum Steele. Can I ask a question? Given that police officers, including special constables, were in the front line of responding to the COVID-19 outbreak at the outset, do you feel that your members were given adequate training in respect of enforcing the new legislation?
Thank you. And again, through yourself, Convener, I think the only honest answer to that is no. The speed with which the legislation was landed upon the police service, and indeed the speed with which many of the subsequent revisions to the legislation were landed on the police service, meant that preparation, training, briefing was rarely available. I don't criticise the police service in any way, shape or form for that. I believe that the service did as much as it could with the information that was available to it in the time frame that was available to it. But almost in spite of that, I fundamentally believe that police officers, with some very obvious examples of where we didn't get it right all of the time, did a sterling job within the limitations of the environment in which they were operating. What was helpful, though, was that the police service itself did not look to be overly punitive to officers when they got it wrong. There was a genuine recognition that we were working in difficult situations, and the service was very quick to put its hands up and say, look, on this occasion we may have not got that particularly got that as right as we could have done, and penalty notices were either withdrawn or rescinded, apologies issued, so on and so forth. But I think just the reality of the time and the speed with which things were landed on the police service, the ability to have that training was not there.
What would be your, Gavina, I just have one side supplementary. Councillor Steele, what would be therefore the key issues that you'd want addressed if you can do it now?
Well, I did write to the Cabinet Secretary back in May, highlighting the fact that there are opportunities to be able to inform legislators' thinking when it comes to emergency regulations that were not taken. The Scottish Police Federation, amongst other bodies, is more than adept at turning round intended provisions very quickly to highlight and to intimate to legislators what some of the practical impediments could be. I think it would be fair to say that after that correspondence, engagement with the Scottish Government at an official level improved significantly, but it always felt as if it was too late in the day to be able to inform the structure of what was coming within a number of hours often.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you, Councillor.
Annabel Ewing, please.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you to Callum Steele for hanging on for a few minutes. First of all, I would wish to say at the outset that I very much commend the actions of all police officers and police staff in Police Scotland for all that they have done and continue to do to get us all through safely to the other side of this pandemic. My question concerns the fundamental tenet of policing with consent, which in Scotland is absolutely the key approach, and it always has been so in terms of policing. I wonder if Callum Steele could indicate whether he feels that there has been any impact on that fundamental principle, and if so, does he feel that that is merely a short-term impact, or does he feel that there would be elements that might persist in the future? Thank you.
Thank you, and again to yourself, Convener. To some extent, Ms. Ewing, the comments in my written submission are in the name of the Scottish Police Federation, highlighting that the policing actions of today are often judged more harshly through the eyes of tomorrow, means that I think probably in all honesty that question is not able to be properly answered, other than to say that our experience at this particular point in time is in line with the comments that have been made previously, that the vast majority of the public are more than happy with the manner in which the police are approaching this particular issue. Of course, as time passes and as legal challenges arise in different jurisdictions, as there is an examination on the relationship between the fundamental rights that individuals are to enjoy and how they were applied to the law, it may well be that the realities of today are distorted by the passage of time. But I do think that the Chief Constable set a very helpful tone very early on. I think often to the dismay possibly of ministers, where there was very clear indications that there was a legislative line that was going to be much more stringent than the policing style ultimately delivered.
I thank Callum Steele for that answer, and I guess indeed time will tell. But I do agree with his main proposition this morning in his answer there, that actually I think the majority of people in Scotland felt comfortable with what was being the approach being taken by Police Scotland. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. And John Mason.
Thanks, Convener. I mean, maybe to follow on a bit from Maurice Corrie, this idea that the rules were changing so quickly. I mean, was there any alternative to that? Because given the infection rates, things had to change. I mean, there was no point saying, well, we'll change things in a month's time. And I think you suggested in your evidence that primary legislation would have been preferable to regulations. But do you just think, was that possible?
I mean, we're in the realms of hypothesis now, I'm afraid, but my personal view is that where there is a will, there is definitely a way, and I would have much preferred for Parliament to have taken slightly more time to put in place a significant set of frameworks to primary legislation that could have predicted, I think, without too much difficulty, that there were going to be flare-ups locally. That there were going to be impacts in certain sectors, that there was the potential for a second wave, certainly that infection rates across the communities were going to ebb and flow, and could have, I believe, with a fair degree of confidence, put in place a legislative framework that was capable of responding to events as they arose, rather than having to deal with them through emergency legislation, because we were often chasing the outcomes rather than dealing with them in advance. So we had, for example, the start of the second wave before we started to put in place the mechanisms to respond to it, whereas certainly all of the scientific evidence and virologists that I listened to suggested that ebbing and flowing and spikes and troughs was an inevitability of this pandemic, and to my mind, Parliament should have looked further sooner.
Thank you. And secondly, and finally, if I may, I mean, there was a feeling that there was a bit of inconsistency sometimes in the policing, and maybe that was because there was confusion over the rules and the regulations. I mean, for example, the Black Lives Matter protests were treated fairly leniently, as were crowds at Celtic Park, but the people defending the statues or whatever in George Square were treated more strictly. Do you think there was inconsistency?
I think there was inconsistency in terms of how the messaging surrounding the mass gatherings issue in the round was dealt with. From a policing perspective, if we take the reality of that environment away and look at people gathering in a peaceful manner versus people gathering in a more aggressive manner, I don't think the police service could have done much more. But I do believe there was a bit of hand-wringing by some parliamentarians. There was certainly a lack of strident condemnation of the fact that the gathering was taking place, regardless of the fact that there may have been some sympathy for the reason that the gathering was happening in the first place. I think one of the most strident examples of that was on the same day in Glasgow, there was a mass gathering in George Square, and I don't believe many, if any, penalty notices were issued. Later that afternoon, there was a mass gathering in Kelvingrove Park, and penalty notices were issued. That kind of inconsistency is what risked undermining, I think, to some extent, the way in which the police approach these things. But it certainly wasn't helped by the messaging that accompanied the politics of it at that moment in time, regardless of the sympathy for the particular cause that people were taking to the streets over.
Thanks, Mr. Steele. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you very much. Can I thank Callum Steele again for allowing us to ask him questions beyond the time that he's available. So I'm now going to return to the question order for the remaining part of the meeting and to ask firstly Maurice Corrie if you have any questions for our remaining witnesses.
Yes, I do, Convener. If I may put my first question to Ian Smith. Ian Smith, good morning. Do you know why the provisions in the Coronavirus Scotland Act 2020 relating to the assessments for adults requiring support were suspended, but those relating to children were not?
I think you'd have to ask the Scottish Government to answer that question. Our view is that neither should be enforced and that the requirements for the children should also be suspended. It's very important that disabled people or people with additional needs get a proper assessment of what those needs are and the services that they need to support them. And we see no justification for the Coronavirus Acts suspending the requirements for those assessments. And indeed, the experience is that although in some areas, some local authorities did suspend the assessments, there is actually no need to do that. Assessments can carry out, and what we think should happen is that they should be reviewed to ensure that where it's necessary, the assessments can be carried out in different ways. So that they should happen, but the assessments should not be suspended.
Can I ask a supplementary to that? And what did Inclusion Scotland do about that? I mean, how powerful was your argument to the Scottish Government to try and make sure your wishes were implemented? What effort was made?
Well, when the Coronavirus Act, the UK Act, which actually suspended the requirement for assessments for social care, and the subsequent Scottish Acts, we put briefings to the Parliament to raise our concerns about those, primarily on the grounds that they were breaches of the UNCRPD, the United Nations Convention on Rights of Disabled People, in relation to the rights of disabled people to receive the support they need. We also raised concerns in relation to cuts in support for social care, which resulted in the whether directly or indirectly, in a commitment from the Scottish Government to ensure that funding was made available to local authorities to prevent further cuts in social care support. We have conducted a number of surveys of disabled people on issues to do with social care and more generally in relation to COVID-19. The results of those have been presented to MSPs and to the Scottish Government, and we hope that those have helped to influence the decisions that are being taken and help to influence the decision taken to suspend the adult social care support assessment requirements. We think that should also apply to children's, but we don't, as an organisation, have as much contact directly with children's services because we are primarily an adult disabled people's organisation.
So if I may just say that, so from your survey, the results were clear that there was a detrimental effect on both the adults and what you know of the children.
Absolutely, that's still happening. Some people have not yet had their service restored to what it was before COVID hit. And in particular, I think a number of people there's a huge increase in the reliance on unpaid carers to fill that gap, and unpaid carers are not receiving the respite support that they used to receive, for example. So they are under huge pressure. So I think there's massive concerns, and we'd have to stress that we do not think that social care support was adequate before COVID-19, but it certainly is not adequate during COVID-19.
Thank you for that. Can I move on to Alison Watt? Now, is that possible, Convener?
Yes, indeed. Yep.
Thank you. Alison, good morning to you. The key weaknesses, which you said in the housing sectors, are clearly around evictions. And obviously related to rent arrears. How would you advise this be dealt with within the extension of the COVID legislation?
The current measures in place don't look to us like they're going to be extensive enough to do the job. So there's a £10 million hardship loan fund. Our information as of the 15th of February is that only £200,000 worth of loans have been paid from that fund to 73 tenants. What we're hearing, and this is consistent with the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, is that many people they either don't qualify for the loans or they're very reluctant to take them. Now, some people have credit ratings that mean that it's difficult for them to get the loans. Some people have also got concerns about their credit ratings being affected by taking one of the loans. And I think what this tells us is that people in housing debt looking at getting into more debt as a response to their debt is not working for people. So we would certainly say to Scottish Government to consider broadening the existing support package and looking at non-repayable forms of support for people. And as I said in my earlier comments, there is a lot of fantastic evidence, both from our local authorities and from housing associations, of housing providers who've put early intervention in place, chiefly around money and debt advice and welfare benefits advice, to make sure that people can be supported to repay their rent over a reasonable period of time.
Fundamental this, I mean, focusing hard in on credit ratings effect, because this seems to be a big issue. What would you advise the government did in ongoing legislation to really rectify that hardship people are feeling by their credit ratings being affected by for whatever reason?
I think, as I say, the answer does need to be a non-repayable form of support. So that's a grant compared with a loan, because I think we are getting into, as I said earlier in the session, absolutely uniquely exceptional levels of rent arrears is what we're looking at. And unfortunately, the worst is yet to come. So we've got the opportunity to put something in place now to avoid the problem happening, which is about people getting into such unsustainable levels of housing debt that they risk losing their home, with all of the costs to the public purse that come with them.
Address the question about the credit rating. What would you specifically advise as Shelter Scotland that the government does about dealing with credit rating agencies?
I think in terms of credit ratings as it relates to housing debt, it's about making sure that there's a non-repayable form of support put in place for people, a grant to alleviate the housing debt, so that the housing debt in itself is not a trigger for a credit rating issue.
Okay, I'm not particularly happy with the answer, but nevertheless, we'll drill down to that in due time. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Maurice, our next questions come from Annabel Ewing. Annabel.
Thank you very much, Convener. In fact, I had several questions for both panellists, but they've actually been asked and well answered, I would have to say. So to not detain the committee unduly, I'm happy to leave it there, Convener. Thank you.
Okay. As long as you're sure, that's very helpful. Thank you, Annabel. And finally then, John Mason.
Yeah, well, just to be more difficult, I think I will ask one or two questions, if I may. If we start with shelter and the evictions, I mean, I think some of the housing associations were concerned that if there's no evictions, then why should tenants bother paying their rent? And I get the impression there's been some tenants, could pay but chose not to pay because they know they can't be convicted. So do you think there's a potential problem with that? Because the arrears have gone up quite a lot.
I think we hear very mixed stories across social housing providers, and even before the pandemic, as I said, there was really great examples of positive practice. So one that comes to mind is Queen's Cross Housing Association, a large housing association in Glasgow, and for a period of 12 months they adopted a position of no evictions. And what they put in place instead was early intervention, getting people debt advice, getting people benefits advice. Now, not only was nobody evicted in that 12-month period, but Queen's Cross Housing Association raised an additional £900,000 worth of rent. So I think we see that just looking at things differently, as I said earlier, looking at things through the lens of a progressive position actually can be better for the landlord and better for the tenant. So I think it's how do we take that learning and make sure that it's applied more consistently across all forms of housing.
Okay, that's a helpful answer, thank you. On the question of antisocial behaviour, I think evictions were still allowed for that, but in fact, in practice, were very difficult. And I had constituents and with antisocial behaviour next door. I mean, it was one of the worst cases I've come across, and but eventually the kind of decent tenants basically left because nothing was happening. And I felt very much for them. Again, in that area of antisocial behaviour, did we get the balance right?
And I don't have them to hand, but certainly happy to furnish the committee with that at a later date. When you look at the reasons for evictions in the social rented sector, people who are evicted on the grounds of antisocial behaviour are a very small proportion of the problem. And again, going back to the pandemic, we were very concerned at Shelter Scotland about steady year-on-year increases in evictions purely on the grounds of rent arrears. In the 2 years before the pandemic, that had gone up by 46.5%. So we've clearly got an issue here about why are rent arrears triggering this response to that extent. I think antisocial behaviour always needs to be taken seriously. I think landlords need to get the balance right between the support they put in place for vulnerable tenants, but as you say, making sure that other tenants have a sense of safety and security about the place that they live. But in terms of proportion, it is a very small proportion of tenants who would fall into that category.
Okay, that's helpful as well. And if I can just ask you yourself one more question. You said hotels are not really suitable, and I'm broadly in agreement with you on that. Is there other accommodation out there available now, or is it more a question that we've got to increase the accommodation available?
I think we do need to increase the supply of affordable accommodation. We're calling on all political parties in their manifestos to commit to building 37,100 social homes over the next 5 years. That's based on research that we did with the Chartered Institute of Housing in Scotland, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, where we gave ourselves the challenge and worked with a number of universities to quantify affordable housing need in Scotland. So we're very clear about how many homes we need. In the shorter term, we need to increase the number of social homes that are allocated to people in the homelessness system, because we had a huge backlog of demand in the system even before the pandemic. That's got worse by over a fifth. We've now got thousands of people literally trapped in temporary accommodation. And temporary accommodation varies in quality. One of the other concerns that we've got is that in terms of the unsuitable accommodation order exemptions being suspended, people then don't have the right to enforce a suitable standard of temporary accommodation, which is absolutely front and centre of people's health concerns at the moment. If somebody is in a form of temporary accommodation where there's things like shared kitchens, shared bathrooms, where they can't safely self-isolate when they need to do so. So I think there's a number of things we could be doing now to drive up the standard of temporary accommodation. We need to increase the supply of temporary accommodation. Ultimately, this is about saying we need more social homes in the system. Our housing, that the weaknesses in our housing system have been thrown into very harsh relief by this public health emergency.
Okay, thanks very much for that. And my very final question then would be to Mr. Smith. And in a sense, a kind of rounding up question. You've said quite a lot about disabled people not being involved in the decisions. So, I mean, is your main concern that the decisions were wrong, or that the way the decisions were made was wrong?
I think it's a bit of both, John. I mean, if you involve disabled people in the decision-making process, you're more likely to get decisions right the first time. I mean, there are simple examples of where measures have been put in place with all best intent to improve the situation in terms of social distancing. So Shotts, for example, having a one-way system, and then they discover that the one-way system doesn't actually have an accessible exit because they haven't involved disabled people in helping them work out what's needed. So it's simple things like that. It's simply, the disabled people are experts in their own lives about how to adapt to different situations, involving disabled people in helping to make the decisions, setting up the systems, whether at national level, at local level, or even at your local shop, will actually make sure you get the decisions better, not just for disabled people, but for everyone. So it's very important to ensure that disabled people, that one in four of the population are disabled. So surely it's not too hard to make sure that the account is taken of those needs in making the contingency planning. And it's one of the key things that we are calling for is in our manifesto for the next elections, is to ensure that disabled people are fully involved in any future contingency planning for any future emergency. So get us involved now, and we can help ensure that when this happens again, we won't make the same mistakes.
Thanks, Mr. Smith. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. We got one very quick final supplementary from Alec Rowley. Alec.
Yeah, it's just to come. Thank you, Convener. It's just to come back on this question of housing. I mean, developers continually talk about affordable housing, but it seems to me affordable housing means all things to all people. There are major blocks in terms of the planning system, land ownership, land availability. So do we not need a national housing plan, recovery plan, post-COVID, that rather than just keep talking about building 30-odd thousand affordable houses or whatever, that we actually can start to set out a clear plan across the country? Does Shelter Scotland support that? And I have in recent times, because you have mentioned quite a number of stats today, but I have in recent times looked at the website. Is there any recent publications that have these stats in them? Because I have been finding it difficult to find those on the Shelter Scotland website.
I mean, just to start with your final point there, in terms of how many homes do we need and where do we need them, so I was referencing earlier a piece of research that we published in June last year, which is our research into affordable housing need. Very happy to furnish you with that. It should indeed be on the website. That's the piece that we did with Chartered Institute of Housing in Scotland and the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. In terms of your point about how do we take the aspiration around social housing and turn that into a plan, I absolutely agree. Like many, we are awaiting the publication of Housing 2040. We really want to see in that a vision for not just the homes that we need and where they need to be, but a vision for the delivery detail, because we need to get that right. I agree with you, there are challenges. But against the backdrop of that, I think it's also recognising that the current affordable housing supply programme of this Parliament is one of the biggest success stories of this Parliament. So we've developed our capacity to build, and I think what Shelter Scotland is saying, along with many others in the sector, is let's keep up the good work, because what we have to do is to make up for decades of underinvestment in social housing. And I think a commitment to social housing needs to transcend parliamentary cycles, indeed transcend party politics. We need to hardwire that commitment into our system, and that's what we're hoping to see with Housing 2040. So we want to see the vision, the delivery detail and the investment plans, all of that coming together to make sure that we decisively end Scotland's housing emergency.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. And that concludes our consideration of this agenda item. Can I thank all of the participants, especially our witnesses, for their time and their evidence this morning, and also to colleagues for allowing us to slightly juggle the evidence due to availability issues. That concludes our business for this meeting. The next committee meeting will take place on Wednesday, the 10th of March, where, amongst other things, the committee will take evidence from the First Minister. The committee will also take evidence on the Scottish Government's refreshed strategic framework and its legislative proposals for the renewal of its emergency powers. I now formally close this meeting of the committee. Thank you.